All right, it is 5 after the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to all of you for joining us for the NCCOR June member meeting. My name is Karen Hilliard, and I'm with the NCCOR Coordinating Center, and I'm going to be facilitating today's meeting. I want to start with a few housekeeping notes. First of all, as you probably already know, the meeting will be recorded and the recording will be shared along with the meeting notes afterward. I also want to let any of you know if you're having audio issues, you have the option of trying the dial-in number instead of your computer audio. And that's the number that you'll see on the screen right now that begins with 888. So you can dial in by phone if you need to. And also, if you're having any connection issues on your end, we suggest keeping your video off if you need to. You can also try moving closer to your router or using a hotspot. That might be helpful if those options are available to you. And you are welcome to keep your video on if you're comfortable or turn it off, whichever you prefer. As a reminder, if you could please mute yourself whenever you're not speaking, and also don't forget to unmute yourself when you want to talk. In addition to speaking by audio, you can use the chat box at any point. It's located on the bottom right of your screen, and you can put questions in there for our speakers during their presentations. You can also send questions to us during the webinar or afterward to the NCCOR inbox, which is ncor@fhi360.org. And I'd like to ask you also, if your name is not appearing on screen, if you could use the renaming feature to change your screen name so that it shows both your name and your agency. And the way to do that is by hovering over your screen name and clicking on More when you hover over your name. So the purpose of today's meeting is to explore how we can modernize data systems to get a better picture of childhood obesity in the US. And we have a fantastic 2 panels for you today. I want to go over today's agenda so you know what to expect. First off, we have a few NCCOR updates, and next after that, we will have our first panel, which is about data modernization efforts within all of our agencies. And followed by, that will be followed by a discussion of how NCCOR can contribute to data modernization. We'll have some opportunity for questions and answers and comments from all of you. And then we will hear from a second panel of experts on data modernization efforts that are specific to childhood obesity. And again, following each panel, we will have a Q&A session with the speakers, and that will be an opportunity for any of you to ask the speakers about their work, how it might connect to the work of NCCOR or work that you are doing. And you can ask questions by raising your hand to be called on or typing in the chat. And after the Q&A, we will have a more open discussion of how NCCOR may contribute to this topic. The agenda, the slides, and the member meeting materials were emailed out to you prior to this meeting. And those meeting materials include speaker bios, NCCOR accomplishments from the past few months, and an overview of active work groups, along with a contact list for NCCOR members. So please check your email for those resources. Materials have also been posted on the internal resources page at ncor.org/internal. And that link is also going to be posted in the chat box in just a moment. So before we get to our first panel today, we have a few NCCOR updates for you. The first one is that we are happy to share the release of NCCOR's latest resource. It is called Creating Thriving Activity-Friendly Communities, Resources to Make the Case for Improving Community-Built Environments. And this new resource collection really builds on NCCOR's years of physical activity research by helping public health practitioners, decision makers, and community members make the business case for investing in activity-friendly environments. On the NCCOR website, you will find some ready-made materials to help facilitate conversations with local leaders. And some of the resources that you'll find there include tips for talking about the economic benefits of activity-friendly communities, a fact sheet on making the business case for activity-friendly places, a customizable presentation, and some recent research articles and other relevant resources. So we hope that you will check that out. We also want to alert you to a couple of recently published resources that you may want to take a look at. Last week, the Active Travel to School Surveillance Initiative Work Group published a commentary and position paper in the journal Translational Behavioral Medicine. And that article is entitled Improving Active Travel to School and Its Surveillance, an Overlooked Opportunity in Health Promotion and Chronic Disease Prevention. And that article offers some insights into strengthening surveillance and data collection of active travel to school behavior, as well as ATS environmental policy and program supports. We've shared a link to the commentary in the chat box, as well as some additional resources from the work group that was published in the past year, including a literature review of existing active travel to school surveillance systems and a white paper summarizing an NCCOR workshop addressing active travel to school surveillance. So take a look for that. We also want to share one additional article that was just published on physical activity and nutrition in childcare settings during the pandemic. It is actually hot off the press and was just published yesterday in the Journal of Frontiers in Public Health. And you can check out the link in the chat box and take a look for that article as well. All right, well, with those announcements, we are now ready to turn to our first panel for today. And I'm very pleased to introduce our four panelists. We have with us Deb Galuska from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, James McLean from the National Institutes of Health, George Hober from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and Melanie Abley from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And just as a reminder, we will again have an opportunity for Q&A with all four of them at the end of their presentations, but you don't need to wait to submit your questions until then. If you think of a question as the speakers are talking, go ahead and put any questions that you have for them in the chat box, and we will get back to those questions during the Q&A. So for now, let me go ahead and hand things off to Deb.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to be here to talk about data modernization at CDC. Next slide, please. So our different organizations probably have different definitions for data modernization, but one that I've heard that I think is very appropriate, it's really creating the types of environments that allow us to get the right data to the right people at the right time. That is data for taking action. Next slide, please. So what are the things that we need to have in place to do that? Well, we need people, processes, and technology. So most of us, if we start at the bottom of the slide, think about the technological things that you might need. So that might include the right platforms, new and innovative ways of analyzing data, new and innovative ways of visualizing data. And certainly those are true. We also need processes in place. And these processes are really the informal and formal rules for doing this. So those might include standard operating procedures for moving data. They might include governance documents. They might include some of the regulations that govern data. So things like IRB, privacy, and other items like that. But probably one of the most important things about data modernization, which isn't always emphasized, is the people part of this. And the people part goes across the data lifecycle. So it includes who has the data and what are their motivations for sharing it. Another place is who is going to analyze the data and do they have the skills to do that? And then the final thing is thinking about the end users and what are their data needs and how do they like to receive data. So next slide, please. So at CDC is going through a major data modernization activity right now, as are many of the agencies in the government. And it has 5 strategy areas that it's working on. So first, It's about building the right foundation, and that's really related to getting the platforms and the technology in place to do data modernization. Second, it's accelerating data into action. So getting that data moving quicker across the life cycle of the data in order for the end user to have it ready for their decision making. Third, CDC is also focusing on developing a workforce that can take on data modernization, both by recruiting new people with new talents and by upskilling the talents of the people already in the system. CDC is also thinking about partnerships. So those partnerships included partnerships related to funding, related to expertise, and related to identifying needs. And then finally, CDC is looking at the idea of governance, and I talked a little bit about that before. So what governs the way we work together on data activities, but also thinking about how we manage change within our organization. So how we get people excited about data modernization and how we make them maybe not as nervous about some of the new and innovations that might come from data modernization. So next slide, please. So what I'd like to do over the next few minutes is talk a little bit about some data modernization activities that are actually happening in our division that might be related to childhood obesity. And I work in the Division of Nutrition, Physical Activity, and Obesity at CDC. So our activities are related to that topic. Next slide, please. So the way I'd like to talk about this is really going back to the idea of data for action. So you identify a problem and you figure out how we modernize data to come to a solution to that problem. So the first problem we've been thinking about in the division is the idea that we don't know what some of the clinical actions related to obesity are happening. So when is screening happening, when are kids sent for treatment? The other area is beginning to understand more clearly some of the comorbidities linked with obesity. So we know some of them now, but it's harder to link the more rare comorbidities. And this is helpful for decision makers to make the case for obesity interactions. So next slide, please. So one of the solutions to that problem is using the compiled electronic medical record data. These are often done by commercial groups, and they pull together electronic health records from multiple systems across the country, giving you the advantage of having millions and millions of records to address your issues with. And CDC used this pretty effectively during the COVID pandemic when it was actually using this data to identify the comorbidities, including obesity related to COVID, and identifying some of the things that were happening as a result of COVID. So for example, demonstrating that children had a very significant increase in weight gain during the pandemic. Next slide, please. One of the issues, however, when you use this data is that it's not research quality data, it's administrative data, and it has some of the problems of that type of data, and that things might be incorrectly recorded, people might carry forward weights and heights, data might be missing. So one of the things that CDC has been working with researchers in the field on is the development of a package that helps you clean that data. So this package is called Growth Cleaner. It's a R package. We use R to do the analysis. It cleans data longitudinally. So it takes all the records of a child and then tries to figure out which might be incorrect. It flags those records and it allows the researchers then to identify whether or not to exclude those from their analysis. Next slide, please. So another problem related to childhood obesity is we want to understand what's happening in the communities, and particularly how we link communities' data to the clinical environment. Next slide, please. So one of the projects we've been working on in the division with many outside partners is called the Clinical and Community Data Initiative, and you might have heard it before, identified as CODI. So what CODI does for the most part is solve the problem of linkage. So it solves two problems. One is it's designed to help link records across time, so they can come from many different healthcare systems, but so you get a longitudinal record for the child or for an adult. And the second is it links data to the community. So for example, if I as a physician refer someone to a community program, that data can be shared then bidirectionally. Next slide, please. So one of the things in order to be able to do that is you actually have to be able to link data. And from a public health standpoint, you have to be able to link this data without giving up the privacy of the individual. So Cody came up with one way of doing that, and that's by basically by hashing the data both from the community and from the clinical environment, so that you get an ID, but it's not an ID with a name in, and then allowing a third party to link that data so that the data can be linked, but there is no identifiers linked with that data. Next slide, please. Another issue that comes when you're trying to share data across many systems is you have to have a common way of collecting that data. And Cody helped solve that problem also. By using a thing called the common data model. So a common data model is basically the structure that's needed to collect data in a consistent way. Cody built upon common data models that have been done by clinical groups such as PCORnet, but added stuff that might be information that's necessary to look at interventions. So that might include things like the sessions, when referrals happen, alerts for when we should do something. So next slide, please. So the third problem is looking at physical activity, and that's the lack of local data on physical activity. Another issue we have is having available environment and policy level data for physical activity. Next slide, please. And so in the division, we have a project called the Physical Activity Data Modernization Initiative. So this project is trying to identify new ways of using secondary data to solve the local data problem and the environmental problem. So we're looking at solving it at the behavior level through movement data. So that's data that's linked to your cell phone that's tracking. You have that on your data when you move with your cell phone. That movement is tracked, and we're starting to figure out whether you can use that to come up with physical activity kind of metrics. We're looking at the environment. So in particular, looking at how we could use data on sidewalks and the quality of sidewalks. And we're looking at the policy, and we're trying to figure out whether we can use web scrapings or other types of artificial intelligence to figure out where policies actually exist. And then what we'll be doing with that data is trying to layer it in across the different local levels so we can link that data across time. Next slide, please. So final problem that we're working on the division is that we want our program recipients, who are both states and communities, to have the data they need available to make their case to their decision makers. Next slide, please. So in the division, we have a interactive database called Data Trends and Maps, and that database focuses on state level data. We have about 60 indicators of behavior, policy, and environment that are used, that states can use to actually find out about themselves and track their progress. So what we're doing in the division now is though figuring out how to try to improve that system. So we're looking at how to improve efficiencies in bringing the data into that system. We're looking at what might be some new innovative visualization kind of things that could be done for that system. And then also thinking about how we can go beyond state data. So how we could bring local data into that system. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, what I hope I've done over the past 10 minutes or so is show you how CDC is dealing with data modernization by trying to figure out the people, the processes, and the technology that's needed to make sure that data can be used for problem solving, that it turns into data for action. Thank you. Over.
All right. Hey, thank you very much, Deb. James McLean from the NIH Alvis Research Program. Just want to touch at a high level, just a couple of things before we get rolling. Then we're going to fly through a bunch of slides. They'll be, here for, leave behinds. Some of the main areas where I think NIH, along with many of the other partners and teams that you have presenting today, are working. Really broadening our data sharing, policies or expectations within things like awards, grant awards and such. Starting to use a lot more frequency of use of large data enclaves for broad-based data access. Really trying to provision, broad access to researchers for data reuse as broadly as we can. leveraging a data passport model within user agreements for flexibility of traversing different research questions over time and efficiency. So I think that's a few of the places where we've been going. I want to highlight a little bit of what we're doing in all of us that kind of leverages those kind of concepts or principles. So let's go to the next slide. Next slide. So all of us at its core is a newly formed longitudinal epidemiologic cohort program trying to enroll about 1 million participants, 1 million or more participants, we would say. We're trying to do that through a range of factors, but in essence, we're trying to nurture a large relationship with lots of people to build a really useful health research data set and to catalyze an audience of research users who want to make use of that information to drive exploration and discovery. Next slide. So in order to do this, right, we're really needing to engage with lots of people in order to enroll a new cohort of 1 million. We're trying to bring together a lot of biological social determinants data into one place. And one of the places we're weakest right now is environmental data, but that's going to be an area of focus for us as we move forward. And then we need to follow those participants and manage to keep track of them over time and try to make that data widely accessible and easily accessible to researchers to study any outcomes they can. Next slide. So within our protocol, we are a largely digital program. We are enrolling adults, but we do expect to be launching a child protocol in the next 1 to 2 years that will enroll a sizable portion of our 1 million participants as under 18. So we've got a fully digital consent process that goes through a range of factors, including authorization for EHR data sharing. We've got we've got a wide set of research surveys that we're collecting. We collect in-person physical measurements from everybody we can. We collect either remote or in-person biospecimens, and then we've been dabbling with wearable and digital data as well. And again, like I said, I think we're going to be moving toward the direction that we discussed in the last presentation, towards more data, privacy-preserving data linkages and broader data access from environmental and other metrics as well. Let's go to the next slide. So again, we really use two modes of enrollment. We have a national enrollment enterprise where we can support digital enrollment from anywhere in the country. We also have a lot of anchor health systems that are enrolling participants as well, highly effectively and at very positive demographics. Let's go to the next slide. So again, this is just to give you a sense of the size and scale, the network of the partners that are driving that enrollment operation. There's a whole nother slide that we normally use that's got all of our engagement partners that are driving outreach for the program. I think that's another factor that I think is really part of modernization, is being able to effectively leverage larger cohorts to do larger initiatives, consortium, collaboratories is kind of a core theme. Let's go to the next slide. So so far, and actually this slide's a little out of date because we have passed a 500,000 participants, so we have consented. We're a little more focused on that 341, the participants who completed our baseline protocol. So we don't talk as much about the consented, but we have consented a 500,000 participants. We've got biosamples for many of them. We've got electronic health records for a large majority of them as well. And we're looking for new ways to fill in those gaps for health records as well. Next slide. So we have enrolled across all states in the country and the populated US territories, but the density of enrollment in those light blue states is very low. So it's in the dozens to hundreds versus the tens of thousands where we've got more of our large scale academic medical centers and enrollment partners. We've got a nice distribution of age skewing towards older adults. And we have been maintaining our goal, which is 50% racial ethnic minority. So we've been hovering right around that 50% range. And if we look at all aspects of diversity that we're trying to metricize and measure, we tend to be roughly 80% underrepresented based on historical precedent in biomedical research. Next slide. So I just want to talk about a couple ways. We can go to the next slide where we're trying to be innovative, right? So we have done a fair bit of intensive longitudinal data collection through bring your own device protocols for participants who are already device wearers for Fitbit, Apple Watches, other sorts of health devices like that can share and contribute data. got data from over 20,000 participants now. That's not all publicly released yet, but we're working towards it. And we've started a device distribution protocol called our WARE pilot, where we're trying to work on two factors, really establishing methods for longitudinal data collection for participants who are not long-term device wearers, and then expanding access to populations and audiences that are disproportionately underrepresented within, they're overrepresented in our cohort and they are not present in our BYOD data. Next slide. So this is just some of the data for how many participants we've captured. So we were over 30,000 for participants sharing digital device data. And so far we've released about a little over a half, almost half of that. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So this is just some data from the WARE pilot. We were a little uncertain what this would look like. We're distributing in this first phase of the pilot 10,000 devices to people who previously weren't wearing devices like Fitbit, distributing Fitbit devices, looking at their long-term wear and compliance for a desired 1 year or more wearing protocol. And so far, we're seeing pretty good retention of the 75 to 80% range for these cohorts over time, which was a little unexpected to me. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So you see one of our problems is consistent with lots of other people's problems. We hit the pandemic time point and we took a enrollment network that we'd scaled up to enrolling 3,000 participants per week and collecting biospecimens from that same, roughly that same audience, to enrolling almost none. And we've been trying to build that back up through a range of methods, including additional remote methodologies for remote collections that don't require in-clinic visits. But again, it's a struggle to get back to where we were. Let's go to the next slide. So again, one of the protocols we launched, we actually piloted this right before the pandemic, somewhat fortuitously, and we scaled it up during the pandemic as remote saliva collection to capture a minimum viable kind of DNA sample is our minimum viable biosample for the program. Our blood sampling collects a much more mature representation of biosamples than that, blood and urine. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So this is just an example of some of the easy kind of access material and packaging and instructions for participants, and that protocol has been working well. Let's go to the next slide. So in essence, over the last about year and a half or 2 years, we've collected 20,000 participants biosamples from this distribution of the map here in terms of zip codes where we've collected samples. About 80% of the kits that get ordered get returned. 80 to 85% of the kits that go out come back, and we've been pretty pleased with the ability to scale our geographic distribution for the cohort. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. One of the other innovations I think AOU is trying to deliver is to provide more, as much back to the research participant as we can to incentivize their continued participation and effectively their value within the program. So we have invested pretty heavily in genetic return results, including what we call our genetic engagement model that is providing ancestry and traits data back to participants. And what's expected to launch later this year is our health-related genomics return, including our genomic counseling resource that can support the return of all positive hereditary disease risk findings. So this is all coming as well. Let's go to the next slide. And so one thing I wanted to note for this team, so even though we don't have pediatric enrollments yet, we do pull a retrospective data for all of our electronic health records, and we pull retrospective data for all of our Fitbit data as well, as far back as it goes within the data systems that we're interacting with. So we actually have, the data gets sparser the further you go back, but we have pretty good density of data that goes back historically in time. And within that, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Within that, we've got 20,000 legacy pediatric EHR data, participants with pediatric EHR data. Allows you to do some somewhat interesting analyses. Here's a particular analysis around pediatric obesity over time. It'd be worth, I think your teams would probably find it interesting. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to make a couple of notes on access to the research data, but all of the slides are provided here, and I'm going to need to wrap up and we can talk more later. Let's go to the next slide. So just for awareness, our research hub, researchallofus.org, is the starting point for finding information about the data sets, the protocol, and registering for access. So that's really the key. All the slides that follow this are information about our public data browser, where you can explore the data at a modest drill down layer, but not much flexibility right now in terms of cross tabulation. But you can look at our genomics data. You can look at our survey data. You can look at our EHR data and understand more about the characterization of the cohort that we have. So that's the public data browser. And if you sign up for research access, you'll need an institutional agreement. That's the first step to that chain, and then individual user agreements. We've got institutional agreements with roughly 300 institutions right now. We've got researcher agreements with about 2,000 researchers right now who are able to access the system. And we're hoping to scale that to 10,000 or more over the next few years. I'm maybe leave it at that, and we can skip through the rest of my slides real quick, and I'll turn it over to George to take over from there.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk about data programming at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I know the focus here is on modernizing data systems for a better picture of childhood obesity, but as I told the organizers, I'm not a childhood obesity expert, but I do know data systems. So I'm just hoping you can apply some of the things I'm going to talk about. I'm hoping that it resonates with your work. So next slide. So this is just an overview of the presentation. I'm going to start by reviewing our approach to data programming. RWJF does not have open calls, so many do not know how we think about certain topics like data. Then I think one of the areas of data programming that's most likely to be relevant to this group is our work on integrated data systems. So I'll define those systems and give an example of what we're doing. Then I'll just review some themes that, in addition to commission recommendations, and I'll talk about the commission a little later on, they're really going to drive our plans for future funding at RWJF in hopes of achieving a modernized data system. So next slide. So these are just our, well, you could call them our big objectives and why we support data at RWJF. Really, it's just to raise awareness about issues, also to facilitate data-driven decision-making, and also support research and evaluation. Next slide. Now, we feel some data sources are better matches to those objectives than others, but we also don't see those objectives as mutually exclusive. But if, for example, we just look at raising awareness and looking at patterns within communities, our focus there is really just trying to make data publicly available. So what we aim for here is addressing challenges of accessibility to publicly available data for making important measures. And those measures have to have national coverage at micro units of analysis. So county health rankings is probably our signature product, but probably of most interest to this group would be something like the Child Opportunity Index, which is housed at Brandeis University. And really that is just, it is a data access project where it creates environmental measures linked to child development for the coverages at the nation, but also micro units of analysis at census tract. So that's one way we support data, and think some of those inputs, filling in key measurement gaps, is a part of a modernized data system. And then next slide. For driving data decision-making about programs and interventions, we tend to support more integrated data. These are organizational level data. So signature programs there are DASH, which is data across sectors for health. And that's designed to facilitate sharing of data, and All In, which is an offshoot of DASH, which is just a learning community that helps to share information on how to share data and a host of topics around IDS. Next slide. And then for supporting research, we often just stand up databases. And so, for example, Health Data for Action is a healthcare claims database we constructed, and it's run by Academy Health, and through them we support different research projects. So those are the three core objectives linked to types of data resources that we support. But then next slide. So finally, and most recently, we assembled a national commission to provide recommendations for an ideal public health data system that could address some of the shortcomings that were revealed in our current public health surveillance and response systems by the pandemic. So I encourage folks to check out that report that came out of that commission. And if these slides are shared, I did put links into mine. So I don't know if those links were retained, but with format changes, but that's just an FYI for the organizers. And then next slide. So moving forward, a lot of our data-related funding will focus on implementing the recommendations that came out of that commission with local and state IDS. So what's an integrated data system? I know this is an audience that probably doesn't need this definition, but still I find that it's helpful just to level set. So it's a system that links data at the individual level. The data are collected in a systematic and consistent way. And the partners in the systems are sharing data across sectors. And so I've listed some key examples here. But in addition to that, as I mentioned the commission earlier, we do have some interesting projects coming out where exactly related to the commission recommendations, we will be directly supporting cities that seek to build IDS to conform to the commission's recommendations. So this is a project that we have with the De Beaumont Foundation that is going to issue an RFP probably later this year, if not at the beginning of next year, looking for cities to do that work. In addition, coming out of that commission, we have direct support to cities to implement the racial equity playbook developed by Actionable Information for Social Policy at UPenn. And they're going to assist folks in implementing their playbook in their existing IDS in different cities. And then also we have a project where we're directly supporting communities to work with HBCUs to collect environmental data in the Gulf states of the country. And those data we're hoping can be integrated into ongoing data collection and analyses by health departments across the region. And that's a project we're supporting through the National Academies of Sciences Gulf Research Project. So I mentioned these programs because they're just opportunities to give access, give researchers access to data for important research and program development. And there's also a lot of partnering, there's a lot of opportunity for partnering with our grantees in the data ecosystem that we can help be a bridge to make that happen. So next slide. And I'm just going to cover themes that are going to drive our thinking on what we want to support related to data moving forward, particularly in this area of intersection of IDS and also our recommendations from that National Commission. And we feel that in supporting that track, IDS combined with the recommendations, that is a path to data modernization. So one priority is making sure data on race are captured in a rigorous way that ensures quality and enables disaggregation for analyses and reporting. Moreover, as you all know, structural racism has been called out by the CDC and many others as a public health issue. So how do we measure racism, and can IDS provide us the right data to do so? Those are projects we would be really interested in supporting. And also we feel data should be analyzed to take intersectionality into account. So analyses by race and parents' educational attainment produce very different findings, as you all know, than analyses that just take race into account. So that parental educational attainment variable is just one of many we're trying to get into data systems. Other priority variables we think about are social position and also perceptions of one's race. So there's also a trend within the private foundation world, at least, to see more question generation from staff at CDOs. So what kinds of information seem to matter for staff at service provider organizations? You know, to answer that question, what matters for them, if that could be built into data systems, we see that as a key part of modernization. So next slide. So we all know there are technological challenges associated with varying data standards and data management practices. And that said, I think some of the examples I mentioned earlier, like Allegheny County, they offer models for how to overcome some of those challenges. But in addition, there are resources like Neuronal Ventures Policy Labs that help with linking data. And I believe these exist across 6 states and DC. There's also the Administrative Data Research Facility of the Coleridge Initiative that helps with linking data. And I'm pretty confident that the foundation is trying to find ways to connect researchers to those resources for the purposes of linking data. I also think we'll be trying to find ways to incentivize more consistent and uniform adoption of data standards. And on privacy, it's clear to us that despite the fact that people complain about legal frameworks, they're not really the challenge. We feel the challenge to sharing data is political will. So projects that can demonstrate why data sharing is effective, those are still needed. So what we are looking for are strong communication strategies that are connected to research projects that use IDS that can make the case that it is worth sustainable support to the creation of local and state level IDS. So next. The final theme we have in our sites is capacity. We heard this in the first presentation by CDC. We constantly hear about data capacity issues in health departments and other nonprofit entities that support data systems. We tried to provide direct support to health departments and different entities to enhance capacity. We found that's pretty costly. I think our current focus is on trying to find key organizations that could help but are underutilized. So for example, with the National Academies of Sciences project I referenced earlier that supports HBCUs, that's one way we could do that, but we also feel there are other institutions like community colleges that are a source of capacity that we see them as excluded from the maintenance of data resources and the training of a workforce, and we would like to get them included. So we're also looking for how to research projects can not only meet the objectives of knowledge creation, but also capacity building objectives. So is it possible for research projects to embed fellows within local governmental departments or agencies or nonprofits who have larger roles beyond just serving the research? I think philanthropy can be particularly effective at supporting projects that have governmental funding from some, say, NIH for research, and we could fund them to do additional work aimed at the capacity building of those organizations that actually hold the data. So I think we're really looking into how research is not just extractive, and that'll be a priority for us, and I think a priority for a lot of other private foundations moving forward. So that is the end, I think. Just under 10 minutes, and there's so much going on. I wish I could have gotten in more specific detail on a lot of these projects, but I hope the themes were helpful, and I hope this information was useful. And I will pass it on.
Great. Hello, everyone. I'm Melanie Abley, and I'm currently with the USDA in the Office of the Chief Scientist. My role is to help coordinate across various different agencies. So I will be presenting on behalf of several USDA agencies today. Next slide, please. So the roadmap for my short presentation is just overall data modernization efforts, which I think you'll see align with some of the previous speakers already. And then specific examples within the Food and Nutrition Service, Economic Research Service, and our National Institute of Food and Agriculture. Next slide, please. So these are just some pictures to show kind of why we're modernizing at USDA. And I think it's very similar reasons for other government agencies. We're aligning with the 2018 Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking and its Title II Data Act, as well as scientific integrity is a big focus within USDA, and is an example of implementing based on a number of recent executive orders, which includes initiatives around public access to the results of federally funded research. And also we are really into open science and trust as well. And these are specifically led by a USDA Chief Data Officer, and then within each of the mission areas, there's an Assistant Chief Data Officer. Next slide, please. So one thing I think is a theme that we've heard is changing the culture around data. And so these are some of the ways that we're working within USDA by increasing data skills and stewardship and analytics, supporting the increased use of AI with safeguards, of course, and developing data stewardship broadly, including standards, quality, inventories and documentation, and then also increasing data sharing and interoperability among USDA and our stakeholders. Next slide, please. We also are trying to connect across the USDA, and so we have some specialized databases, including the Food Data Central. We have a research data catalog and repository, which is the Ag Data Commons. And those links are being put hopefully in the chat. I included them in my presentation for the notes. And then also research analytics platforms, which include SciNet and AgCrocs. And then we have a departmental analytics platform called EDAPT. Next slide, please. So specifically at the department level, these are some of the goals within the EDAPT infrastructure that's being implemented. And so you can see kind of what we were thinking at the department level to help prioritize getting that data access across and having it in a visual way, and a way that we can really kind of see the trends. Next slide, please. Here are what some of those, oh, I think it's an animated one by accident. So I think there's 4. There we go. One more. Perfect. So these are just some of the splash pages for some of these data sets that I mentioned. So the Food Data Central is an integrated data system that provides expanded nutrient profile data and links to related agricultural and experimental research. The Ag Data Commons is a public government scientific research data catalog and repository available to help the agricultural research community share and discover research data funded by the USDA and meet federal open access requirements. The SciNet initiative is an effort by the USDA ARS to improve the USDA's research capacity by providing scientists with access to high performance computing clusters, cloud computing, improved network for data transfer and training in scientific computing. And the last one is AgCrocs. And this website provides information, data, and data resource links to some of the USDA ARS natural resource genomics nutrition efforts. The site is designed with the intent to provide agricultural research data to the public research and development community. Data contained within these sites applications represent data entries as well as complex data relationships among hundreds of scientific measurements and experiments. So those are just some examples of data sets that are kind of at the department level and across the USDA. So next slide, please. So now I'm going to move into some specific examples from specific agencies. So the Food and Nutrition Service conducts applied research and analysis to inform and evaluate food and nutrition assistance programs. Historically, few studies have focused on disparities in program access, provision of benefits, or outcomes to inform actions to improve equity. However, I'll provide some examples where this information has been added in recent years and discuss plans to strengthen this area. Next slide, please. The primary reason for identifying disparities is to assess equity in program access, the provisions of program benefits, and program outcomes. Traditional FNS data elements are included on the slide, specific for program access, participation, program benefits, and outcomes. So you can see some of the data elements that traditionally FNS has looked at. Next slide, please. And here are some of the challenges of measuring equity within FNS administered programs. First, it is still an emerging concept. Also, not all states provide the same types of data. Some will provide data on race and ethnicity, but even fewer provide data on accessibility. Also, some programs are set up where FNS cannot require certain types of data collection. However, the research and analysis teams are working on ideas specific to identifying metrics. You can see a couple examples there on the slide. Next slide, please. Moving on to the Economic Research Service. Next slide, please. The Economic Research Service Consumer Food Data Systems is a large compilation of data, statistics, and value-added products that ERS integrates from government, commercial, and academic sources. The data is available in a wide variety of formats to aid in accessibility and research. ERS is also partnering with Robert Wood Johnson on this initiative. And the next couple slides will just give some examples of this combination of research, but there's many more that I don't have time to cover today. So next slide, please. So one example is the Food Environment Atlas. And this includes 200 indicators of a community's ability to access health, food, and the success at the county level. The various indicators are included on the slide and take into account a variety of inputs, mostly from already published external data sources. Next slide, please. Another example is the ERS Food Security Report, and also a way these data are utilized, looking at the research from ERS to improve food security measurement and publishing guides for measuring food security available to other researchers. ERS experts have also been able to include specific food security questions in several national surveys, which are listed on the slide, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. Next slide, please. Another example is the Purchase to Plate suite, and this adds value to proprietary data by linking the USDA nutrition, linking it to USDA nutrition data. This is a collaboration between ERS, ARS, and FNS's Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion. The Purchase to Plate crosswalk links purchased products to generate nutrients and food pattern components. The Price tool and Purchase to Plate ingredient tool calculate the prices for foods consumed by NHANES participants and includes the purchase weights for ingredients to make those foods. Next slide, please. The last example I'm going to give from this suite is the food apps. And this is a collaboration between ERS and FNS as well, which was nationally representative of US households within the 4 target populations, which are listed on the slide. This is a set of comprehensive data on household food purchases and acquisitions over a 7-day period between April 2012 and January 2013. There's also a Food Apps 2.0, which is also in the works to get some more data, and they've expanded upon some of the original food apps. So last, I want to switch to NIFA. So next slide, please. And yeah, thank you. Let's see. So NIFA wanted to highlight how they are using a letter of cooperative agreement to help advance the implementation of the Cooperative Extension's National Framework for Health, Equity, and Well-being. This work has a lot of implications for what data we gather relevant to health, equity, and well-being across our National Cooperative Extension system, and how particularly with an equity lens. Next slide, please. NIFA also wanted to highlight the evolution of one of their Agricultural Food and Research Initiative, or AFRI, for short priority areas known as A1344. AFRI is NIFA's flagship funding program. And from 2011 to 2017, the USDA's AFRI program had a competitive grants program that provided funding for research, education, and extension projects directed to obesity prevention. 82 grants awarded produced over 550 peer-reviewed published articles. The Open Access Childhood Obesity Journal supplement noted on the slide here highlights several publications that showcase the priority areas' impacts, including innovative approaches to data collection and analysis among children and families. Next slide, please. NIFA's Data Gateway includes NIFA data and publicly available data to provide a framework for analyzing evidence-based research, education, and extension needs, driving program development and public trust, and added value around food and nutrition. Data can be accessed for NIFA's funded projects and are available also on either the Research, Education, and Economics Information System, or REEIS, and the NIFA Data Gateway. Just as a brief high-level overview of the data available from NIFA, there's a user guide as well as a congressional map linked in the text of this gateway. And the search bar for the data gateway is found on the left of the page if you go to the link. And then next slide, please. This is an example of a query. Once you've constructed your search, you can also filter the data by a variety of variables, including funding program information. And this allows for a greater selectivity in project review. So that's my last slide. If you go to the last slide for my contact information, I know I had to go, the USDA is doing a lot of various different things, and I only touched on a handful of our agencies. But there are other people on as well, who are experts from each of the agencies. So if there's any specific questions, I can try to answer, or I'm sure others that are on can also help answer questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Melanie, and thank you to all of our other speakers in the first panel. So much good information here, and I know everybody probably has a lot of questions and comments for our speakers, and we're going to get to that in just a moment. I do want to note how many links have been shared for the information that was presented in the chat. So be sure to grab some of those if you're interested in particular ones. And we will also be sending those out, of course, after this meeting. For now, we're going to move into some Q&A and also really want to have an open discussion with all of the participants here today. And so I want to let you know that you can put your questions into the chat if you would like to, or you can raise your hand in using the Zoom raise your hand feature, or if you want to just jump in by audio, you can certainly feel free to do that. And we will try to get to all of the questions that we can today. We've got a good amount of time for discussing this first panel. We're going to go until 1:30. So plenty of time to get to the points that people want to hear more about or new points that they want to make. So let me ask for anybody who has a question to please go ahead and put it in the chat. And in particular, we would love to hear from those of you in the audience about how you feel some of these opportunities, some of the gaps and needs that were identified may be relevant to your own work or to NCCOR in general. And again, you can feel free to take yourself off mute. I'll start with one question while we wait for the audience to put in some questions into the chat. And that question is that there were so many resources identified here today. How would you suggest that somebody get started trying to make sense of them all or move through some of these to find the things that are most applicable to their own work? And any of the panelists can jump in with their thoughts here.
This is James. Let me say two things real quickly. One is that obviously exploration is the initial opportunity, but I think that there's a larger theme kind of across all this work. Speaking largely towards the more complexity of multi-level modeling that is kind of running across a lot of these initiatives, opportunities, data sets, data systems, and I think that to the extent that you're interested in more of a kind of a broad-based opportunity for that, I would look at these resources. I would look at systems like all of us, where we're trying to capture from kind of really from like biology to behavior pretty holistically within one data set, and just go explore.
Okay, other thoughts from anyone? I'm wondering, as we think about the way that surveillance was interrupted due to the pandemic, what role can NCCOR play? And I would invite any of the panelists to respond to that, and then any thoughts from our members who are tuned in.
I'll say one more thing and try to be quiet after that. And it's back to the multi-level modeling challenge, right? I think that the reality is a lot of the work where NCCOR, I think, started, and a lot of the work around health behaviors and assessment, and then the linkage of that across all the levels of complexity from environment and onward, policy and whatnot. I think that the reality is many of the folks here on the call have got a pretty sophisticated view of the methodologies and approaches and methods. And you guys have done a lot of work in categorizing and cataloging those sorts of methodologies and approaches. I think that it's, one of the real opportunities is to bring some of the methodological expertise to bear either in, proposals to use the data where it's not publicly available, or to support opportunities to explore innovative ways of data curation, data linkage, other sorts of approaches. I think there's a lot of opportunity where we could look at, what more can we do when you layer the data opportunity to the methodological innovation that probably exists within this researcher community.
Other thoughts from our panelists?
So this is Deb. I think one of the opportunities that exists here is the use of some of the non-surveillance kind of data, so not some of the non-government data, answer some of the questions we've had about what happened during the pandemic, which is what we're going to miss basically with the many of the current surveillance systems. And some of those really are taking advantage of like the electronic medical records data and maybe the mobility data and some of that stuff where we were able to see in real time what was happening during the pandemic and use that for decision making.
Okay, excellent. And I'm wondering for the folks who are in the audience, as you're hearing about some of these data modernization strategies that were mentioned today, is there any one of them that really jumped out at you as something where you were like, wow, I didn't know that existed, and here's what I'm thinking of doing with that resource? Any wheels that started turning for participants that you could share with the group?
Hi, Karen. This is Heather Hamner from CDC. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
So I don't have anything in terms of my wheels turning, but I did have a question that I was hoping the panelists might be able to comment on. One of the things that I was noting with the discussion was there's a lot of complicated pieces of information that are being collected in systems and linking things, and it's incredible. But it can be hard to communicate to the people who really need it. And thinking about what Deb was talking about, getting the right data to the right people at the right time. And how can we as NCCOR think about taking this really complicated information and make it something that people can understand and really use and then act on? Because not everybody is going to really understand the complicated data modernization piece of it. They just want the take-home piece that can really help when they're thinking about a program or something that they're trying to do on the ground. So do the panelists have any suggestions on how we take this really complicated information and make it something that helps people who aren't data scientists understand how important the data science is? Does that make sense?
Yes, excellent. So panelists, thoughts on this?
So one thing that we think about sometimes is designing our research studies or our surveillance activities with the end user in mind. So learning about the data they need before we start, so that we're collecting that data, we're getting that data, and that we're able to communicate that data to them in a way that meets their needs.
Anyone else? We've got another question from a participant that I can go to. Or Melanie, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to share that that's obviously something that we think about a lot at the USDA, and we are strategically planning sessions with various different stakeholders to help us better understand what do they need so that we can better tailor whatever our messages are to them. Specifically standing up, a tribal relations group within the USDA, and other ways that we can help just kind of help educate ourselves so that we can really better tailor our messages.
Excellent. All right, we had a hand up from Janet Fulton, and then I'm going to go to the question in the chat. Janet, do you want to jump in on audio?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. This is a great session. Thanks, everybody. My question is going a little bit deeper into the question of, serving the partners and the key stakeholders. What if the data modernization is really meant to kind of form this feedback loop with partners? What kinds of needs are you all hearing from your partners? Like, what's kind of their top need in terms of data modernization?
Anybody want to jump in? Go ahead.
I'll say one from it's kind of an all of us centered perspective, but it cuts across the health research, I think, more broadly, is that the deeper we go into EHR and informatics and phenotyping, I think that the more the data completeness problem becomes the real puzzle to solve, right? Because oftentimes we've got very partial data access for a lot of the data types we're collecting. We don't have all the necessary information. So I think continuing to drive on the privacy preserving record linkages and more supports to enable these sorts of data linkages that bring together the larger picture are going to be essential to answering bigger and more complicated questions. I think we'll get good answers with partial data, and we'll probably get more refined answers the more we can complete pictures like that across multiple data types.
Anyone else on this one, or should we go to the next question? We've got a question in the chat from someone who would love to know more about the integrated data systems from RWJF and how the data is being collected, and a little bit more about the longitudinal aspects of it. So George, if you're able to address that, that would be great.
Sure. I mean, that's really going to vary by place. So these integrated data systems that I was referencing are, some of them are statewide. Most of them are really city level. I think the best way to answer your question to get at some of the variation is to look at a resource like, I referenced actionable information for social policy. That was a program that was developed out of UPenn, recognizing that in a lot of administrative data resources, the needs for those data match the practitioners, but they also could be leveraged for research, but there wasn't very good timing on the part of what the researchers wanted and what the practitioners were doing. So I was trying to link research and practice in a way. If you look at that program, if you search around their website, you'll see a list of the different sites. So South Carolina is a statewide one, Allegheny is a county one. They have other, and they're at different levels of what kinds of data they're integrating, at what time periods, what are the measures. You'll see most of them slant more to the sharing of education data with other sectors. Health is largely left out. That's a key challenge of when we talk about sectors, cross-sector data sharing. It seems like health is the one that's last to get there. And there's reasons for that. That's difficult. But then, that's one part of what you look at AISP, but I also reference something like the Coleridge Initiative, which is the administrative data research facility. And that is one that takes those little AISP models and says, well, the data you have there, and I hope I don't misrepresent that, we want to be a bridge that links you to de-identified census files in the way that someone like Raj Chetty used IRS data to create the Opportunity Atlas, but you have to be able to do that in a secure space. So they'll be the bridge between the census files and the secure space that you could bring your integrated data from a site like Allegheny County and link them there. So that's a, you know, they take very, this is a long-winded way to say, those integrated data systems take very varied forms. And so you just have to kind of check them out by model. And maybe others could add if they have experiences with those systems. But the, you know, the challenge with them, they're really thoughtful questions here that I was quiet because I just didn't know the answers. But on the part of like NCCOR, for example, like what can NCCOR do? You know, you get these different systems that they're hard to connect to one another. And I think like that's one thing that I think the foundation has kind of failed on program. I shouldn't say failed on, we just didn't think of it. Or, you know, when you get programs out of CMS, like Accountable Communities for Health, and you're building these data systems, like, could you have done it in a way that better connects the data across sites to one another? And could we have promoted the standardization of, well, the adoption of standards to enable that? And well, we didn't, but that's one way NCCOR could help, is thinking like, where are the key places in the development of these systems, and with research that we could find ways to make sure that they're linked. But anyways, I don't know, I welcome input from others. It's a very long answer to that's actually a big question. IDS contains a lot.
Anyone have anything to add to that? I have a question related to making this information, these tools, more accessible to end users. Are any of your organizations planning or already offering training for how to use these specific tools? Or is that something that you're considering in the future?
So I can comment on some of the tools that were developed as part of the CODI project, which I was talking about, the data linkage project. We are in the process of developing toolkits that will be posted. And I don't have the link of where they're going to be posted, but that will be posted for others to be able to use and to learn from the things that we learned as part of that project.
From all of the side, we have a pretty robust researcher onboarding and training support portfolio. We've got training resources that are on, both publicly available and then available within the workbench once you gain access through your user agreements. We've got a series of demonstration projects. So we've got a methodology and the underlying researcher platform that allows for us to make publicly available and shared workspaces where there can be sample code repositories, example analyses, and that's particularly helpful for complex analyses or anywhere where editing the underlying data model is not complex, but implementing the overarching methodology is more sophisticated in terms of coding. So those are places where I think we're doing a lot, and I think that that's where I would be really excited in terms of some opportunities for NCCOR to contribute potential methodologies within shared shared workspaces or shared environments that could advance the opportunity for the broader research community to think maybe think differently about problems that they're looking at and questions that they might have to drive that work forward.
And we got one comment in the chat just now from Heidi Blank that Growth Clean R for cleaning electronic health records for children and adults BMI is already available on GitHub. So that is already out there. I have one question for all of our panelists. You each described the ways in which this data is being protected and de-identified, but I'm wondering if there has been any pushback from the public or from any advocacy organizations who may worry about privacy concerns, and how you would answer that in a simple way that that would be understandable to most audiences.
I mean, all of us has certainly wrestled with this. I wouldn't say this is the wrong word, but wrestled with the complexity of communicating both the awareness to research participants of the fact that, it's exposing, an awful lot of information on genomics, EHR, self-reported measures, all very inherently personal in nature and private. It is a struggle to both communicate that the value and the risk of that in a way in which we don't discourage participation, and it is a differential communication challenge to, I think, different audiences. So we are enrolling a very diverse audience within all of us, and that message is differentially received in terms of where the value proposition of the research participation lies and what that means to them for their perception of risk within the exposure of that data, the potential exposure of that data, relative to reward of representativeness of the data that is being used to develop research projects in the future. So I think it's a complex challenge, but it's also it's an opportunity, and one we should I think we should all strive to learn from each other on, is the biggest one, because each of us are taking a different sliver of data, a different focus, a different orientation, right? And we're trying to communicate the complexity of that. And I think where we can bring together those messages and methodologies so that we can see what's successful and what's not and evaluate it and then try to improve is going to be the real win.
Right, we have about 9 more minutes left for questions. Please go ahead.
I think privacy is a topic we deal with a lot at the foundation, but I think James is right. Like, it really varies by different types of data you're looking at. And, I do think the Center for Data and Technology, I think that's right, Center for Data and Technology, CDT out of DC, they're doing interesting privacy work. For information on this topic, I think they're worth checking out. But otherwise, this is the domain of you hear interesting new governance models popping up, such as data trusts and data unions. Those are interesting conversations. I think data trusts are more, they're more European, where privacy, I think, is taken a little more seriously. But we do have a set of programming that is kind of exploring, developing community data information systems that run along those models. Not data unions. That's very new, and that basically means you get compensated. You get compensated for the data you provide on yourself, and that's some people feel really strongly about that in a positive way. Some feel strongly in a negative way, and thinking that they're not realistic. So, but worth looking into.
And so for anybody who wants to jump in with an answer to this, to what extent is each agency working with private IT companies and their data modernization innovations? Is that happening? Companies like Google, Amazon?
I mean, we're certainly from the NIH side, we're continuing to expand, as most people are, across the federal enterprise and elsewhere, our, cloud portfolio of resources, assets, tools, and data systems. So we certainly are leveraging what I think is probably the best of resources that we can from both those companies' underlying product portfolios, but also the researchers who are advancing, privacy within that space at large, and how to maintain it. I think the other, positive benefit of some of these larger scale research implementations, at least from the NIH side, has been, a drive towards adoption of a federalized standard for privacy and security. We have, very, well documented, standards for privacy, security, federal systems. But for the most part, research platforms were externalized, right, as extramural projects. And those extramural projects had differential expectations. But as we do these bigger projects centrally and internally, we're able to apply a higher standard and a higher bar towards those data systems, their security, their compliance with federal expectations. And the federal expectations are maturing as the world of computing matures.
I know there has not been a lot of data collected on the birth to age 2 group in the past. Is there any way that we can do more to encourage data collection in that population?
George, you're on mute.
Yeah, these questions are super hard. I'm thinking. On that last question though, with private companies, I just wanted to point out my experiences with them have mostly been, they offer 2 services, analytics and storage. I would like them to open up and share data, but I don't know how successful we'll be there. But I'm thinking more on that's a very young demographic, and yeah, I'm thinking.
On the last question, I think that, you know, when all of us launches a child protocol, which is coming, well, we intend to start in the birth to 6 cohort. The fundamentals are there's less complexity to that for us as a digital national program than there is in going into adolescence, for example, where there's a lot more issues to wrangle. So I think we'll progressively work ourselves up from birth to 6 towards younger children, and then ultimately adolescents in the end.
And just commenting kind of on that issue of the private companies, I think it's also worth us thinking through that the government doesn't have to be the person who gets the data, that actually those companies can answer questions for us that doesn't necessarily have to involve us in some of the, you know, some of the nuances of working with the government. So that kind of rethinking of them as partners in answering questions versus just providers of data.
All right, other questions or thoughts? Yes, go ahead.
On the private tech side, again, like, I think I was responding mainly to Google and Amazon when I noted the storage and analytics, but there are many smaller private tech companies that I think do really interesting work. So, for example, we funded a project with Harvard during the peak of the pandemic that was looking at sentiment analysis. They were doing sentiment analysis. They were scraping social media data to see how populations were responding to the messaging coming out of mayor's offices around mask mandates, around whatever rules and regulations were being put in effect around COVID. And how could those be framed in a way that would increase uptake or at least acceptance? And so I think there are tons of little companies, not tons is maybe generous, but there are a lot of little companies doing important work like that has a direct public health benefit that I think are worth partnering with.
All right, well, we have just a couple minutes left in this segment. So I want to make a last call for any questions from participants on the phone or any last comments from the members of our panel. Any closing thoughts here or closing questions? All right, well, we may just move on to our next set of speakers and keep things moving. I do want to say thank you again to the panel that we've just heard from. And again, if you think of additional questions as we move forward, you can continue to put some of those questions in the chat. Or we will be glad to take your questions after today's member meeting and get those to the speakers and then get some answers out to all of our members. All right, well, next panel up is going to consist of 2 presentations. The first one is from Susan Wolford, who is from the University of Michigan, and her colleague Corinna Kerbnick, who is from Kaiser Permanente. And then after that, we will hear from Louise Bauer with the World Obesity Federation and the University of Sydney. So again, I want to remind you, as you are listening to the speakers, please put any questions that you have or any comments that you have right into the chat. We'll come back to those at the end. We will have a short time for Q&A at the end of this panel, and then a few brief announcements before we close out the meeting about an hour from now. So I will now hand it off to the first speaker in our panel, Susan and Corinna, it's all yours.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'm just going to take over the screen here to be able to share my slides. And thank you for this opportunity to share about our work. As mentioned, my name is Susan Wolford. I am a general pediatrician at the University of Michigan, and I will be presenting today with my colleague, Dr. Kubnik, on our work that we've done recently looking at the increase in weight during the pandemic lockdown. And so just as some background, I focus at the university a lot on weight management, and here I am exercising with our teens in our weight management program, and we have that. A lot of community engaged work with our partners in Flint, where, as you know, there's been a lot of issues that affect health and wellness. And so we're very involved in that community engaged work. And now I focus a fair amount on the creation of apps to help adolescents in these obesogenic environments to make healthy choices. And this particular app is all about detecting by location apps where somebody is, and then sending them messages that hopefully prompt them to make the healthy choice while they may be surrounded by lots of unhealthy options. But I see patients in clinic, and like so many of you, in the midst of the pandemic, we began to see charts, growth charts, much like this, which of course made us think, really, is it true that kids really are gaining a lot of weight during the pandemic and more than they were before? Are there differences by age? And are there communities that are harder hit by this, as indeed the pandemic is hitting some communities in disproportionate ways compared to others? What would be the long-term impact of this weight gain? And are there new interventions that are needed in order to address it? So naturally, one might think I would try to address this with data from the University of Michigan, but there was a slight dilemma in that we don't have a particularly diverse population in Ann Arbor. And so I discussed this problem with one of my mentors, Ken Resnickow, and he said, aha, I have just the group for us to work with. And he'd been collaborating with colleagues at Kaiser and reached out to them and said, would you like to explore this question as well? And of course, they were really in an excellent position to address this, because when we compare their population, we see that there was much more diversity there to be able to answer the question. There was another factor that actually made California a perfect place to look at this, because at the time, California had one of the highest per capita rates of COVID-19 infection in the world. And so another factor that came into play was that with their shelter-in-place declaration, schools closed and remained closed. So they were closed from April 2020 all the way into January 2021 and beyond. And that really made a difference to what we were able to explore in this study. So it allowed us to look at a retrospective cohort and create that cohort of school-aged youth, 5 to 17 years of age, and to compare their weight gain during the pandemic lockdown period in comparison to a similar period in the year before. To be in this cohort, all the patients had to have a BMI, at least one BMI measurement from June of 2020 to January of 2021, and also had to have at least one BMI measurement in the corresponding period the year before. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Corinna, who's going to talk us through a little bit more about the cohort.
So at Kaiser, we were really excited when Susan and Dr. Resnikow approached us. I was working with Dr. Resnikow already on a project to use motivational interviewing in pediatric practices to encourage patients to make lifestyle changes. So our source population that we had at KPSC were about 1.2 million children between the ages of 5 and 17. And we then excluded those that didn't have continuous membership in the last 24 months prior to the pandemic, because we wanted to be able to exclude children that have complex chronic conditions. And complex chronic conditions are really conditions like cerebral palsy, where you need a team of physicians and where you have a lot of doctor's appointments to make sure that this population doesn't skew the data. So after we excluded those, we had about 570,000 kids left that did not have complex chronic conditions. And from there, we further excluded those that didn't have a BMI during the pandemic. And those became our eligible cohort of roughly 200,000. And we next, for the analytical cohort, excluded those that didn't have a pre-pandemic BMI to compare it to. So overall, we were left with around 160,000 children. Because we had to exclude quite a bit to make sure that we had the necessary number of BMI measures, we were concerned about selection bias, and we carefully compared our study population to the 1.2 million youth that we had in the first place with regard to several demographics. And our cohort was strikingly similar with regard to all factors. Our cohort is relatively diverse. The majority of kids are of Hispanic origin. So we had about 400,000 BMIs, BMI measures pre-COVID that went into the analysis. And in the graph here, you can see the number of BMI measures before COVID. It's quite stable, kind of wobbles around by season. And then you see during the pandemic, there's a sharp drop in March, April, and May. And then it quickly resumes to over 80% of the pre-pandemic BMI measures. So because we had no in-person visits in March, April, and May, but well-child visits had to be in person because we were very concerned about the vaccination records to start lagging. So for the pre-pandemic phase, we had about 2.6 measures per child, and during the pandemic, about 1.8. Now I can see the number, doesn't matter. So this is a picture from a population, from a publication that shows the virtual data warehouse that was actually a way of standardizing data across several HMORNs. The HMORN is the Health HMO Research Network. So we all have the same kind of standardized data structure. All these different data sets from a relational database are connected via a personal ID. In our case here, it's the medical record number. And in 2 cases where we use census data, we connect via geocoding and using the patient's address. For the data here, we use primarily the demographics data set, the vital signs that contain weight and height to calculate BMI. And then we use the census demographics to have neighborhood education and income and the parks. So how was race and ethnicity assessed? We used self-report as gold standard. Since the 2009 HITECH Act, race and ethnicity is assessed in Kaiser as part of the meaningful use of the electronic health records requirements. We use several sources, the administrative data at sign up, then check-in at kiosk. If race ethnicity is missing, the patient is taken through a race ethnicity assessment. If they don't check in at the kiosk, the receptionist will do the same. And for children, we have the opportunity to supplement with birth certificate data. There's some limitations with the data, but they're fairly minor. Legacy data before the HITECH Act, if they haven't been corrected because the patient or the provider noticed something is wrong, they might be incorrect. For the statistical analysis, our main outcome was the distance from the median BMI for sex and age, and because that gives me a headache, we decided to also provide data on weight adjusted for height and the percent of overweight and obesity. We used mixed effect regression models for the continuous outcome, Poisson regression for overweight and obesity, and we use models that accommodate the missing values and the repeated measures in our longitudinal cohort. We carefully checked what fits our data best and determined that a linear term would be the best fit, but we had a very heterogeneous group of age cohorts, and we decided to stratify our cohorts into 3 age groups. All models that you will see are adjusted for sex, neighborhood, education, and income. Body weight and BMI are also adjusted for BMI for age group at baseline, and then the model for body weight is additionally adjusted for height. For the disparity models that are at the end of our presentation, we included three-way interactions for the pandemic, then by time, and then by race, ethnicity, neighborhood parks, and state subsidized health insurance.
Thanks so much,
And
Corinne.
with that, I'll hand it back to Susan.
Thank you. So just to highlight the findings that were published last year in JAMA, we'll look at this by the age groups that Corinna mentioned. So starting with the oldest age group of 16 to 17-year-olds, comparing their change in weight over the pre-pandemic period compared to the pandemic period, we see here that there was approximately 0.5 kilograms per meter square excess gain during the pandemic period. If we look now at if we go from the 16-year-olds and move to looking at the 12 to 15-year-olds, we see here that they had an approximately 0.9 kilogram per meter squared excess increase during the pandemic period. And then to the group that was most significantly impacted, the 5 to 11-year-olds, here we see an over 1.5 kilogram per meter squared excess increase during that time frame. So as we mentioned, we've also looked at these data and looked at the disparities in weight changes during the pandemic lockdown. And these data are currently under review. So I think at this moment, we're going to stop the recording, but give you a sneak peek at what we found. Neighborhood deprivation. And we have those data available and will plan to use them moving forward. And of course, these indices provide information about education, income, employment, household characteristics, and housing at the neighborhood level. And clearly that brings in some problems of communities not being completely homogeneous, but certainly it would inform our findings or improve the findings and conclusions that we can draw. We want to also look at food insecurity. And we know that particularly during the pandemic, this is a concerning issue for many families. And we do have measures of food insecurity in the EHR, and so plan to use that moving forward. We also would like to look at lifestyle habits, so nutrition and physical activity. And we again have these data in the EHR, though we do have some questions about social desirability, and listening to some of the resources that were mentioned earlier, some of the more objective measures might be really interesting to have. Of course, it's a little bit harder to use cellular data for young children and their activity, but nonetheless, there are some ways that we can incorporate this into our analyses moving forward. And then we'd also like to look at family level data, for example, work circumstances, which we know were impacted significantly by COVID, and personal finances. Currently, we don't have data in the EHR that we can use to help us get to these issues. But with that in mind, we are happy that we were able to at least answer some of the questions that came up. So we do know that indeed it looks like our data indicate that children were generally gaining more weight, that there were in fact differences by age, with the younger school-age children being most impacted, and that it certainly seems from our data that Hispanic and Black youth from low-income backgrounds and those without as much access to neighborhood parks saw a greater impact on their BMI during the pandemic lockdown. We don't know the long-term impact of this weight gain and what interventions are needed in order to address this excess weight gain. But we know that there's a lot more work to do in this area. Those of us who are doing this work clinically are certainly seeing the changes continuing in a patient's weight as this pandemic time continues even beyond the lockdown. But certainly it means that while this is the end of our work at present, it really is not the end of the story. And there's a lot more work to do and many, many more questions to answer using these data. So with that, we'd like to thank you so much for your attention and hand back over to the moderator. Thank you.
All right, and we can go right on to Louise Bauer. Thank you so much to Susan and Corinna for that presentation.
Hello, everybody. Good morning from Thursday morning in Sydney, Australia. And it's tremendous to be able to talk with you. I'm coming here in my capacity, both as President-elect of the World Obesity Federation, and I'll be talking about World Obesity's resources, but also as an obesity researcher, particularly working with aspects of the Top Child study, which I will explain. Now, I think I need to ask for the next slide, please. You can see my these are my disclosures. In the next slide, I'm going to cover issues to do with the World Obesity Federation and the EPOC collaboration, Early Prevention of Obesity in Childhood collaboration, and the Transforming Obesity Prevention in Children study. Thank you. Next slide. Next, and next as well. What is the World Obesity Federation? Well, it's actually an international NGO that has membership from about 80 people from 80 different countries around the world, so professional organizations and also people with lived experience, and has roles in global advocacy, convening, education and capacity building, and evidence and data. It's headquartered in London and has staff in London, in the UK and Boston. In the next slide, You can see the range of activities where World Obesity is working. And so it covers quite a great deal of the world, and which includes parts of the US. If we go on to the next slide, and then the next, we'll have a look at evidence and data. Now, I want to really encourage those online to go and look at the World Obesity website. This is a really great resource, and particularly look at the Global Obesity Observatory as well as the World Obesity Atlas. In the next slide, thank you. And I'm going to focus now on the Global Obesity Observatory, and you'll be pleased to know that I've put together some slides focused on the United States. So you can look by country, by region, and you can delve down into each country. If we look at the next slide, you can see data summarized in this type, and there's also with behind the scenes work looking at national obesity risk and particularly childhood obesity risk on a standard score used across every country. And then you can deep dive into obesity prevalence trends over time, and you can look at the report card. And you can do this for almost 200 countries. In the next slide, we can see that you can scroll down and check out other data summaries for each individual country, or you can go to region. So you can look at population breakdowns, drivers, comorbidities, policies, health systems, etc., etc. So it's a wealth of data, particularly if we're wanting to compare other countries. Thank you. In the next slide, you can also look at data in a map across the whole world. And here you see data for boys living with either overweight or obesity. It's using newest available data from each country. And we've down the bottom, you can see the individual WHO region summary. And basically the darker the color, the higher the prevalence. This is school-aged boys. And you can see, for example, you won't be surprised that the Americas, North and South, parts of Europe, Middle East and China, and indeed Malaysia. And you can't see it here in great detail, but so many of the Pacific Islands have very high prevalence rates of overweight and obesity for boys, and this will be the same for girls. You can also look up data for adults. In the next slide, you can also look in more detail. You can access the data tables and check out the data sources. And for the United States, for this particular one, for the prevalence of overweight and obesity, it was using 2017 to 2018 national data and was using the International Obesity Task Force definition. So you can check that out for every single country. In the next slide, you can also look at the scorecards, the regional atlases, the economic analyses. Now, all these publications, almost all of these, use the NCD risk factor collaboration data. And this was done, work was actually done in collaboration with people from the NCD risk factor collaboration, except for the ones, the scorecards that deal with clinical care and economic costs. If you want to delve into more detail with these, then Dr. Tim Lobstein oversaw most of these papers, and Rachel Nugent from RTI International undertook the special project on economic costs. And you can either contact me or you can go directly to Tim to find out more information. Tim would be the source of greatest knowledge. In the next slide, you can also go and look now 3 years back, we had the 2019 Atlas of Childhood Obesity. And at that time, that gave the latest estimates of infant, child and adolescent obesity prevalence in 191 countries. And was data from the NCD risk factor collaboration that was modeled data. And it essentially provided evidence of the prevalence, the numbers of children living with obesity in 2030 that were modeled, and the probability of achieving the WHO target of no increase in obesity prevalence by 2025. Spoiler alert, you won't be surprised that basically no country meets that criterion. 2030 predictions were undertaken by Dr. James Bentham, then at the NCD Risk Factor Collaboration, and the risk score calculations were undertaken by World Obesity Federation staff, and they took into account current prevalence, infant stunting, maternal obesity and smoking, and breastfeeding rates. I'm sure many of you will know that the NCD Risk Factor Collaboration study is Professor Izzati from Imperial College London. In the next slide, we can look a little bit more at some of the data sources from for the World Obesity Atlas of Childhood Obesity. And you can see down in the table there the different risk scores. So meeting the WHO target, latest survey, 26, where the date, children with age 5 to 9, those with 10 to 19, et cetera, et cetera. And then you can see down the right-hand side where it was calculated from, the data source, and so on. Thank you. On to the next slide. These data were then used to calculate the numbers, not the prevalence, but the numbers of children and adolescents aged 5 to 19 globally with obesity. And these were the predicted numbers to 2030. And what you can see is that there was an estimated 160% increase in 10 years from 2020 to 2030. So up to 254 million with obesity. Just highlighting, this was of course calculated on data pre-pandemic. Now, where do these live? In the next slide, we can see a table of the countries predicted to have more than 1 million school-aged children and youth living with obesity in 2030. There are, if you click on the next, we'll actually see that there are 42 top countries, and 35 of these are low or middle income countries. 3 of the top 4 are in Asia, and the USA is number 3. Now, as I mentioned before, these predictions were undertaken before COVID impacts appeared, but I think you can highlight that there are countries really having very large numbers of children and youth living with obesity estimated by 2030. In the next slide, I just want to reflect on some of the lessons on data use from the World Obesity Federation. I think there's tremendous value in collaborating and bringing together a range of data sources and doing it over a long period of time. This World Obesity Federation part of its aim is to support people with evidence and to bring together, be almost like a clearinghouse, but certainly a place that's actually going to be useful for people. These data summaries are especially useful for policy decision makers. They provide clear snapshots and concise information. They're also actually quite useful for all of those, for lots of people who are doing, just academic work and as well, because it actually gives, you can actually have you can find one place, particularly if you're going to find information about another country. It's easy to use, it's publicly available, it's readily accessible, and it's able to be updated by the World Obesity Federation staff. And it's essentially got data for all countries. So that's a tremendous advantage. So you may think, how might this work in the US? Those are questions for you to reflect upon, but maybe the approach used by World Obesity Federation could be useful for some of you. Okay, let's go to the next slide. I also want to talk about the early prevention of obesity in childhood collaboration and the transforming obesity prevention in children study. So let's go to the next slide. Initially in Australia and New Zealand, there were 4 Australasian trials underway aiming to prevent obesity by age 2. These were interventions that were occurring either late pregnancy and then going through to almost age 2, or they were starting in early infancy. And they were parent focused, and they were aimed at promoting healthy infant feeding and a range of other good practices. And this group of people came together around a dinner table at an Australian-New Zealand Obesity Society annual meeting. Always really good to go to in-person meetings. And we realised that we were conducting these, all just got funding, were about to get funding to do these trials. And we decided, well, maybe we could learn more by combining the data from all the trials. We agreed to share the data and do a prospective individual participant data, or IPD, prospective meta-analysis. Along the way, we established the Early Prevention of Obesity in Childhood, or EPOC collaboration. That's also then taken on a life of its own. We have a good website, so I encourage you to go there, earlychildhoodobesity.com, to find out more. In the next slide, I just give you a little bit of information about prospective meta-analyses. These are studies that are defined as eligible for inclusion in the meta-analysis, and the hypotheses and analysis strategies are specified before any of the results of the studies or cohorts related to that research question are known. So you could have a de novo prospective meta-analysis. You could have a prospective meta-analysis while the trials are underway. And this was this very first one that we did was actually a combination of two of those first two, or you could even have a prospective meta-analysis of mostly completed trials. Let's go to the next slide. Individual participant data meta-analyses are where you actually source the data directly from the researchers responsible for each study or data repository. You therefore have a gold standard for meta-analysis. You can include unreported data with consent and allows for some harmonization across studies. In the next slide, you can see that this is usually feasible with an experienced team. We'll keep on going. I've got a little bit more to get through. So this is an example of, these are the 4 Australasian trials down the left-hand side, 3 different from different parts of Australia and New Zealand. And you can see that they actually started recruitment, well, within about a couple of years of each other, and then they continued over 2 years, largely 3.5 years, and then 5 years follow-up. But we actually formed the collaboration and published the protocol about 10 years before we actually did our main outcomes paper. So this is something that takes a period of time, because you've got to wait till the last one is done when you're doing this prospectively. In the next slide, what did we find? We found that when we had over 2,000 mother-child dyads, and we found that compared to usual care, there was a modest reduction, those where you had early intervention, a modest reduction in BMI Z scores, prolonged breastfeeding, a reduction in TV viewing time, and reduction in some undesirable feeding practices, such as pressure to eat. In the next slide, we were able to combine the BMI Z scores and look at these over time, and you can see that at age 2 there were significant differences between BMI Z score between the control and intervention using individual participant data, but this was no longer apparent by ages 3.5 and 5. We weren't continuing any intervention there, and those effects, the feeding practices and other weight-related behaviours also diminished with time. In the next slide, this then gave birth to the Transforming Obesity Prevention for Children study, which is bringing together all the completed, planned and ongoing trials. So it's not a prospective meta-analysis, but it is an individual participant data meta-analysis. So to date, 49 trials with 40,000 participants have joined Top Child and agreed to share their data. And you can check out the Top Child collaboration website. And we're looking at, while there is a nested prospective meta-analysis, we're doing work on deconstructing the interventions. I'll talk briefly about that, and identifying effective intervention components. Into the next slide. You can check out our published protocols in BMJ Open. And in the next slide, I just want to tell you briefly about deconstructing components. These behavioural interventions are often very complex with multiple strategies, and traditional evidence syntheses provide limited understanding of these. So, however, there are now several taxonomies and ontologies to understand interventions and their discrete components using the behaviour change technique taxonomy, the template for intervention description and replication checklist, and the Human Behaviour Change Project, which has a series of ontologies under development. You do need access to standard operating procedure protocols, the protocols, maybe even have a talk with the interventionists to get a better idea of what is occurring. Can you go on to the next slide? In summary, these are the new generation or next generation methods for data sharing and analysis. Instead of having a summary of one study and then a summary of the next and combining them, you can actually have the individual participant data from both of those studies. So that gives a richer analysis, or you can deconstruct these complex interventions, as you can see below, into their component parts, and you can better understand what is in each study and what is in each trial, what is in each, what is being undertaken. Thank you. In the next slide, this sort of approach, of course, requires collaboration. It's not about people, not just papers, and it needs good management of all of those. In the next slide, we just summarize briefly about collaboration management. These people are being asked to hand over their babies, their individual participant data. So you will require memoranda of understanding. You need applications to your institutional review boards. You need support to do that. People, of course, do have opportunity to provide input into the protocols, statistical analysis plan and data interpretation, authorship on protocols and publications. And some collaborators may wish to deep dive more and be involved into the research process. There may be opportunities to harmonise some outcome studies, measures, and the combined data are only published once all included studies are published, and you need regular meetings and updates. In the next slide, I just want to reflect on the lessons from that. You need an experienced core team, and we happen to have one of those at the University of Sydney. They need to have experience in data management, data checking, and statistics, and they need to really appreciate that collaboration management is key, ideally with engagement of trialists upfront in all aspects. The intervention deconstruction requires access to protocols, standard operating procedures, and other documents, and great attention to detail. And this is a long-term, not a short-term venture. In the next slide, I want to finish by acknowledging my colleagues in the Transforming Obesity in Children collaboration, the Centre of Research Excellence, what has now become a very long-standing collaboration, the Early Prevention of Obesity in Childhood, now Translate, and the World Obesity Federation. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you to all three of our panelists. We've heard some amazing information here, and I know we already are starting to get some questions in the chat. I'm going to go to one of those first, and I would encourage anybody else with a question to please put your question in the chat, or when there's a pause, you can jump right in on audio if you would like to do that. And so the first question is one for Drs. Wolford and Kerbnick, and that is, could you tell us more about the park access measure in your study? And specifically, how was a neighborhood defined and how were the number of parks quantified within those neighborhoods?
We have address data of our members, and our address data gets regularly geocoded every year. And then we merge the geocoding with census data, usually on the block level. And there is a park program. So we use ArcGIS software, and there is a layering package that's called Esri from 2019 that we layered over it, and then we just linked it. Does that answer your question?
Is that good? And you can feel free to take yourself off mute. I think that question was from Dave at CDC.
Hi. So is that a census tract number of parks in the census block group, or And I guess the next question there is, is it just the number of parks? Is Esri calculating the number of parks for the census? Or is there some weight to perhaps to account for the size of the park? Because perhaps you have access to one very large park. Thanks.
It's just the number of parks, and it's by census block in this case.
Okay. All right. Another question that we have is also for Dr. Wolford and Dr. Kerbnick, which is that parents went through all kinds of occupational changes during the pandemic. And is it possible to get specifics on the changes in the nature of parents' work, that is in-person versus telework, new versus new unemployment, and the childcare that was available either through a center or an in-house nanny or grandparent, et cetera?
So these data, unfortunately, are not in our electronic medical record in a way that we can easily access or that they are standardized. In some cases, if there's concern about obesity, the pediatrician may discuss it and make some documentation in the progress notes, but that would not be standardized and would require natural language processing to extract it from there. And because it's not done in every encounter, I doubt we would have a whole lot of data. So if we would want to do this study, which I think would be really, really interesting, we can only do it by doing additional data collection using, for example, an NIH grant mechanism. What we do have now, but we didn't have it then. So we just started asking these questions in fall 2021 for social determinants of health and food insecurity in the past 12 months. So we will have those data looking forward. But that does not give you really the answer to the question how work and child care influences the weight.
We're really glad that that question was raised, because as we were trying to point out towards the end of the presentation, that those are the kinds of things that we think are really important to helping us get some more nuanced answers to the questions that we have. And some of the SDOH questionnaires that we give to patients in clinic can help. So we ask patients here at U of M, we ask patients whether or not they need help with employment. So there's some sort of tangential ways that one could consider, but not a really satisfactory way to answer these questions at this point.
All right, I have a question for Dr. Bauer here, which is how can national governments make the case for prioritizing international childhood obesity alongside domestic childhood obesity?
I wish I really did have a great answer for that, because then I would use it all the time myself. What we have been, some of the work that World Obesity has done has been certainly in the past with support from the European Union, which of course was multi-country, and because it was based physically in the UK, which was then part of the EU, it was eligible for a range of collaborative grants, which were always then included non-EU country analyses as well. But we've World Obesity Federation has essentially had to look for non-targeted funding to support its broader work. But I completely agree with you. If you're not part of the EU, it's going to be more challenging. Sorry, that was somewhat flippant response. I think it varies from country to country. I know within my own country, we've been able to get some funding from our NIH equivalent to do some of this collaborative work. I do think it's great to be able to, and we do have, for example, there is National Health Australian NIH equivalent and EU collaborative grant opportunities. I'm sorry, I'm not across what's available with NIH, but I think that's how that could be done. I think working with groups such as World Obesity, we're very keen to work with groups within the US, anywhere in the world, to actually grow and look at data in more detail. There are some good people there and good resources that certainly support dissemination and collaboration. So I would just want to encourage people to think that through. One of the things I think we've found challenging, we've been able to do it, but even just getting funding over many years to support collaborations because it takes a while to set up this collaborative data sharing opportunities, to establish trust, to have processes that go well. Of course, you need to have groups who are already really well established in doing it, but it can take quite a while before you get your first real outcome papers coming from it. And so you've actually got to have that underlying support going for quite a period of time. To be able, that's a little bit more challenging. And we've certainly worked hard at that. We've also established this Centre of Research Excellence that's essentially includes people from Australia and New Zealand. And it's not just the data I've showed you there, but a range of other issues that we're doing, all in that sort of 0 to 5-year-old obesity prevention space. But all of that takes time, and and it's also really good to establish trusted relationships. I can't emphasize that highly enough over a period of time. So turning up, being there, knowing people, turning up at meetings, being supportive, co-supervising PhD students, allowing people to work across traditional areas, all of that's important in trying to allow these things to happen so you can do as much as possible with as little resourcing as possible.
Thank you. All right, we've got about 5 minutes left for the Q&A here, so I encourage anybody with additional questions or comments to put that in the chat. And I have another question here for Dr. Wolford and Dr. Kerbnick, which is, how can government agencies and community-based organizations work with healthcare systems to access and share electronic health records data that's privately owned?
We are actually doing this quite frequently. Usually there's a grant or a contract in place, for example, with NIH or CDC or other funding agencies. We also have collaborated directly, as one example, the First Drive LA initiative needed a comparison cohort, and they approached us to build a cohort within LA when they did the intervention, and use the rest of the Southern California membership as a virtual control cohort that was made similar to the LA cohort using some statistical magic. And we just aggregated the data and contributed to the analysis. So it's just approaching organizations and asking, putting some contracts in place. In most cases, if there's not a long established collaboration, the analysis might be done in-house because we usually don't feel comfortable handing over large data sets. Those are meant for research, and we want to make sure that the privacy concerns of our members are addressed.
Okay. Right. Any other questions from the chat? I have one last question for Dr. Wolford and Dr. Kerbnick, which is when you looked at playgrounds and parks, and obviously felt that physical activity was an important factor. I know you haven't had an opportunity to get all the information that you would need about nutrition, but how much of a factor do you believe nutrition may have been, especially for kids who were eating primarily at home versus maybe having been fed one or more meals a day at school during the rest of the year?
So I think this is such a big question. For so many children who come from lower income communities, that meal at school is incredibly important. And while there are lots of opinions about school meals, there definitely are efforts to ensure that what children are receiving is provides healthy options. When they didn't have that opportunity to eat at school, and then they're dealing with more instances of food insecurity and dealing with eating the cheapest thing that can make one feel full, definitely that's a problem that we think played an important role. And so being able to actually measure those data and be able to see how children's diets changed over the course of the pandemic, I think is important. And the other part of this is that I don't think it comes to an end even when you now sort of are back in school, because have we set up some sort of preferences that are now very hard to change, especially with these younger children once one goes back to school. But there are a myriad of questions about how nutrition changed. For adolescents, maybe they were having sort of less access to fast food because they weren't out of the house buying fast food like they may have done. But then, of course, for younger children, it may have had a different impact. So that's an important question that I think is one we have to invest in studying moving forward.
Right, excellent. Looks like we are at the end of our questions in the chat. So I want to thank our three final panelists here. It's been a wonderful presentation, such a great member meeting today with so much new information presented and a lot of food for thought for the future. So thank you again to our panelists. And I want to say thank you to all of our participants as well, all of our members who have joined us today. And want to tell you a couple of ways that we can continue this conversation. In addition to the next member meeting, we are open to hearing suggestions that you have for member calls, for Connect and Explore webinars. And if you have suggestions or you're working on any childhood obesity related project that you would like to share, we would like to hear about it. So please email us at ncor@fhi360.org. And I see there was a final question in the chat for Dr. Bauer, which we will get to her and try to get that answer out to folks, since we're at time for our Q&A right now, but we'll get that responded to and let you all know. So thank you for that final question. All right, so as we continue to close out the day today, I would like to ask you to mark your calendars. We've got some dates coming up for our future member calls. We have one on July 20th, another one on August 17th, and then on October 19th. So please save the date for those and join us for those NCCOR member calls at that time. Thank you so much again to our final panel, to our earlier panel, and to all of you who participated today. And we hope that you will have a wonderful week, and we look forward to seeing our members next month. So have a great rest of your day, and thank you again.